All right, guys, how we doing today? I wanted to talk a little bit more on our black and white series. First thing I want to let you know, I do want to apologize if I seem a little bit rambly and all over the board or a little more scatterbrained than usual. I was up kind of late last night, had an opportunity to do something extremely fun. I was very honored to be a part of it, and it's something that was very, very cool for me. I'll be sharing more about that in the coming days. So stay tuned for an announcement on that. But today we're here to talk about part 2 of our black and white series here. And yesterday we talked a little bit about the overarching concept of composition in your photographs and how that becomes so much more important to a degree with a black and white photograph versus a color picture, because you don't have the color to kind of pull the eye away from some of the maybe loose or sloppy compositional things that sometimes we get in the habits of doing. So all that being said, you know, composition obviously is key to any picture, color, black and white, it doesn't matter. But I just feel that a lot of times in a color photograph, because the color can play such a large role, it can sometimes mask a little bit of a sloppy composition and things like that. So the main thing that we're going to touch on today in regards to black and white photography falls under the umbrella of composition. And what I mean by that is within composition, and like we talked about yesterday, keeping things simple in your frame, there's a lot of things that really fall under that same, umbrella, for lack of a better term. And the biggest thing that we look at there, once we get past just the general thought of paying attention to the scene and keeping the scene very clean and simple and focused on our subject, is we start looking at the placement of those items within our frame. And what you'll notice when you really break it down to a point where you can really just, get past the detail in a scene, like, oh, okay, here, look at that tree right there, and you're noticing the branches. If you kind of step back a little bit and really look at a scene, you'll find that one of the big elements that makes any picture successful, but especially so in black and white, is that there are always a series of shapes laid out in that image. Now, these shapes might be triangles, they might be circles, squares, rectangles, anything like that. Usually those more basic shapes end up forming an overarching theme. Now, one example would be in a couple of the clips you saw, I was shooting down a road. And anytime you get that where you've got trees meeting sky, meeting land or mountains or anything else in the background, you'll notice that oftentimes the sky will form a shape up there. And if you can make that sky be arranged in your scene somehow so that it's almost pointing at your subject, and a great way to do that is with the use of a triangle shape. And the scene I just showed, the road was coming down, the trees had separated a little bit, obviously, for the road, and the sky on top of the frame actually made a triangle that kind of pointed down into the scene. What that does for you is your eye is naturally going to see that space. It's a big negative space up there, which is also very important. A possibly slightly different topic, but the use of negative space is critical because it lets your image kind of relax and breathe a little bit, and helps break up some of the visual tension that can turn a viewer away from your image. But back to shapes. That shape of the sky can actually help point down to the road. Now the road also becomes an element because that's a line in your image. It's something that is drawing your eye through the scene and telling your eye where it should look next. It's one of those kinds of elements. When you look at where the trees came down in the clip I showed you earlier, they came down on the side of the frame, and where the sky came pointing in and the trees came up, if you look close, the trees kind of form a rough triangular shape of their own. So you've got two triangles coming together, and it's almost like the pieces of a puzzle when everything starts fitting together. And that's where it becomes really important, especially in landscape photography, but also for portrait work, product photography. It doesn't matter what you're shooting. It becomes really important to be aware of how the elements in your frame are fitting together. And when I say shapes, they're not going to be exact. I mean, these are not going to be perfect little rectangles and squares and triangles and all of that. They're going to be kind of the rough outlines of a shape up there. One of the easiest ways to help you see what those shapes are going to look like before you make that picture is to either look through the viewfinder and squint your eyes a little bit, because that's going to let you kind of defocus your eye a little bit, and you'll notice you lose sight of all the specific details, branches and things like that, and you just start seeing the general outlines of shapes and things like that. The other way, which is sometimes much easier than, squinting your eyes and feeling dumb if people are around, is to basically just hold your camera up, looking through the viewfinder, and spin your focus dial a little bit, so that your image is a little bit out of focus. That way you'll see the general tones and shape in the image, and you can kind of maneuver your camera and move to different places to make sure that everything is kind of fitting together. When you think about it, a photograph is either a rectangle or a square typically, depending on what format you're shooting in. Most commonly, for the majority of people, I think they're shooting in some version of a rectangle, some aspect ratio. And so you want to look at it and make sure that within that rectangle, it's broken up into a number of different shapes that will help fit nicely into that box that we're calling our final image. And when you're successful with that, those shapes are aligned in a way that it helps draw your eye through a scene, and it helps to, really bring focus on what it is you're trying to use as the subject in your photograph. Now, the other thing that becomes really critical to use along with those shapes, and it happens kind of naturally when you start realizing the shapes and noticing those and planning your images around that, is that you'll find that there are things called leading lines through an image. Now, many of you, I'm sure, know all about leading lines. Most popular examples would be, using a road or something like that, or not my favorite example, but a lot of people like to use it. It's the railroad tracks going out into a scene, things like that. And what that does is it brings your eye into the image. Now, those are very common examples, but you'll find even in nature, it might be the way that a shoreline meanders through an image. If you're shooting, say, from out on a dock like I was just a moment ago, back towards a shore, that shoreline is going to have these natural twists and turns, and it's going to meander through. And as the perspective of the image gets further and further away, you'll notice it'll draw your eye right along that. Now, if you can use those lines in a way to help bring them right over and frame it so that your subject is placed along those lines, it just really helps a viewer when they're looking at an image to tell them. It's like a roadmap on where their eyes should go next. And it's very important. Now, there are a couple things to get really technical about leading lines, and I'm not going to do that here, where you have to be careful that you don't lead their eye right out of the picture and things like that. That's a topic for another time, but just be aware that there are always things that form shapes and lines in your image that are going to draw your viewer's eye all the way through that and really help them see what it is that you're trying to portray in that scene. Now, speaking of, the lines and shapes, the other factor in there is that there's oftentimes patterns that are formed by things. Now, this happens not just with the typical, when I say textures or patterns, a lot of people will think, oh yeah, like the texture of a brick wall or things like that. Those are definitely textures and patterns, but that's not really what I'm referring to here. What I'm talking about is when you have a natural occurrence of items that will either repeat in an image, or they'll be bunched together in certain areas and form a pattern or a texture within that image to give it a little bit of depth, and to really just do, again, like I said, a good job of kind of taking your viewer by the hand and walking them through your scene. So that's what I wanted to focus on today. Now, we're going to get into a little bit more tomorrow. I've got, I think, 2 more parts to this, and some of that is going to include a little bit of sitting at the computer and showing you some of these things on a few of my images as I try and work through converting some of these into a strong black and white image right on my computer. So look forward to that in the coming days, and we are going to take care of that. Again, the announcement about what I got to do last night, which I'm super excited about, that'll be coming very soon as well. So stay tuned for that. And until tomorrow, you guys take care. Have a good evening. It's Friday. Have a great weekend, unless you're working, at which point I hope work goes smoothly for you. And I will see you tomorrow.